Good day. Before I proceed with this video, I'm going to just remind you that if you're watching any of our videos on Rumble, that's to say the Duran videos or videos by Alexander Mercouris or Alex Christoforou, then if you go to the top of the video, you will find a red maroon button, and if you press that button, that will take you directly to our locals homepage, where you will find our thriving community, which you can join. And of course, if you choose to become an active member of our locals community, you can publish your own exclusive content on our homepage, and you can participate in my Wednesday live streams, which take place at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. Well, today's video is going to primarily focus on certain statements by the Russian and Chinese foreign ministers about the general state of the political crisis around Ukraine and the state of the negotiations. But before I do that, I'm going to start with my traditional sum up of what I understand and see as being the situation on the ground. Always, as I said, this comes with the caveat that I'm not a person with a military background, and military affairs have never been something I've been particularly interested in, or at least not up to now. I would say, and I would repeat again, that anybody who wants a military appraisal, an appraisal by a genuine military expert, an actual former Marine officer and a US intelligence official of the situation in Ukraine, well, the place to do that is by checking out our recent live stream on the Duran with Scott Ritter, who has provided a masterly explanation of what the military situation is in Ukraine. Well, I think now a point which we've been hammering away on the Duran and indeed on this channel, literally from almost the start of this war, that the main focus of the war is in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, with the Russian objective being the destruction of Ukraine's army in Donbass. I think that is now universally accepted. It's fascinating to see how at the start of March, all the emphasis was on the situation in and around Kiev. Then sometime around mid to late March, you began to see a trickle of articles appearing in a few places. The first one, as I remember, was in the London Times. The second one was in the Financial Times, and there were a few odd articles appearing in other places like the Daily Telegraph. Obviously, my focus now is on the British media, or gradually acknowledging that it was in fact in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, that the major battle was taking place, and that the Ukrainian forces there were at serious danger of encirclement and eventual destruction. And what was being discussed on the margins in mid to late March is now the universal point of debate, since the Russians withdrew their forces from the area in and around Kiev. And there's been, interestingly, a comment now from the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, in which he said that the Russians will take some weeks to redeploy their forces in eastern Ukraine, and then this will result in the climactic battle for eastern Ukraine. And Stoltenberg suggested that the Western powers need to use these weeks in order to try to reinforce Ukraine to the extent that is possible. Well, I note all that with great interest from Stoltenberg. That's not what he was saying, by the way, at the start of the conflict back in March. I would say that I think that Stoltenberg rather underestimates the extent to which fighting in eastern Ukraine continues to be ongoing, with the Russians and their allies, and the militia of the two republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, continuing steadily to tighten the noose around the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine. Reports that I'm getting, and I have no reason to doubt them, is that Russian forces continue to push south from the town of ETHEREUM that they captured some days ago, some weeks ago, and that they're well on the way towards the Kramatorsk conurbation, where the Ukrainians are apparently feverishly trying to build up fortifications, and where it seems that they're intending to make their last stand. So it seems to me that the Ukrainians are fighting a rearguard action to try to slow down the Russian advance, but that the Russian advance continues remorselessly towards these two towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which, by the way, students or observers of the First Ukrainian War of 2014 will remember well. They were very much the epicenter of at least the early stages of the war during that particular war in 2014. But anyway, this seems to be the place where the major battle is now shaping. And of course, all of this comes along with further information of increasing numbers of surrenders of Ukrainian troops in Mariupol, and a die-hard element now camped out, still holding out at the Azovstal steelworks, apparently the largest factory in Ukraine, and also to some extent in the port area, but with these two forces now divided from each other and heavily pressed. Now, yesterday, the Russian Ministry of Defense published a briefing in which they said that there'd been yet another attempt by Ukraine to send helicopters into the Azovstal steelworks to evacuate someone there. The Russians used the expression commanders of the Azov battalion, but that, of course, begs all sorts of questions. Both of these helicopters, according to the Russians, were shot down before they reached the Azovstal steelworks over the Sea of Azov. Now, that would mean, by my count, that the Ukrainians have now lost 5 helicopters trying to evacuate people from the Azovstal steelworks. And of course, with those helicopters, which have been shot down, brave and valuable personnel, Ukrainian pilots and soldiers, have been killed in respect of an enterprise of evacuation that I truly do not understand. And the Russian general who provided the briefing made the point that on Monday the Russians actually opened up a corridor. They established a brief ceasefire and opened up a corridor, and they informed the Ukrainian troops at the Azovstal steelworks and in the port area in Mariupol, and also, of course, the Ukrainian government, that if the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol laid down their arms, they were free to evacuate through this corridor, but that the authorities in Kiev rejected the offer. So I have to say, this all is looking extremely strange. I mean, what exactly is it about the Azovstal steelworks? Who or what exactly is there that would explain why the Ukrainians are trying to evacuate them by air, hopeless though that appears to be, and incredibly dangerous as it also appears to be, but are not prepared to have them evacuate by agreement with the Russians through a land corridor. None of this makes very much sense or logic to me. Now, if you go onto the internet, especially if you go onto the Russian internet, the Runet, you will find endless theories and speculations about Western troops and advisors in the Azovstal steelworks. There's a video that I've seen of a soldier, presumably from one of the militias, I think from the Donetsk People's Republic, holding a cap and some kind of insignia that appears to belong to somebody from the French Foreign Legion. there have been some even wilder theories, which I'm not going to repeat. I don't know how much credence can be placed on any of these theories. I've talked about in a previous video about the theories that there are Westerners in the Azovstal steelworks. It does seem remarkable that whoever is in charge prefers to take the enormous risks of evacuation by air rather than evacuation through a safe land corridor mediated by the Russians. So I just wait to see what's going to happen and for the eventual explanation that we will no doubt get. But in the meantime, I've also seen film, which I have no doubt is indeed reliable, which shows Russian heavy artillery trundling into Mariupol. This includes very powerful mortars and other artillery pieces, and presumably their purpose is to level the Azovstal steelworks and the port area in order to smoke out the Ukrainian troops there and presumably either force them into final surrender or engineer their complete destruction. I would add that following the mass surrender of a Ukrainian battalion which took place yesterday, which, by the way, the Russian Defense Ministry has now confirmed, there have been more reports of more mass surrenders by Ukrainian troops in Mariupol. These obviously are on a much smaller scale than that of the Ukrainian battalion I talked about. But anyway, such surrenders apparently continue. Well, that's the situation in Mariupol. We do seem to be, as I said in my previous video, in the very last closing stages of this prolonged battle. But as I said elsewhere, it does seem as if forces are gathering, Russian forces are gathering around the remnants of the Ukrainian army in Donbass, which is now apparently preparing to make its last stand around the towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And Stoltenberg's assumption that this is all going to take weeks for the Russians to redeploy may not be true. What I would say is that there also is now video footage, which, by the way, I can't confirm its accuracy. I mean, I can't say whether or not the video footage is shows entirely what it appears to show. But there is substantial video footage of a very large gathering of Russian forces around Kharkiv. And note that the Russians have never said that they're pulling back their troops from Kharkiv. And apparently there have also been further advances of Russian troops near the city of Nikolaev on the Black Sea coast. So it could be that over and above the major battles in Donbass, the Russians may be preparing something with respect to Kharkiv and Nikolaev. Then again, it may all be another distraction. It may all be the game of smoke and mirrors that the Russians have been playing to keep the Ukrainians dispersed and unsure about what Russian intentions are. And I still get overwhelmingly the feeling that the real battle is going to happen in Donbass. Anyway, that seems to me as good a summary of the military situation, the overall military picture, as you are likely to get. Incidentally, on the question of Western arms supplies to Ukraine, I gather that there are increasing complaints from European members of NATO that they have run out of stocks of some of their most valuable equipment. Apparently, the German government has even hinted that its supplies of weapon systems that it's been shipping to Ukraine have almost run dry. And this is apparently also been said by other governments. The Czech government, by the way, is apparently ferrying T-72 and BMP armoured vehicles to Ukraine. This is the first time that tanks and armoured vehicles have been supplied by a NATO member state to Ukraine. These are the same types of weapon systems that Ukraine has already been fighting with. The Russians claim that they have destroyed 1,980 Ukrainian tanks and armoured vehicles over the course of this conflict. If that number is anywhere near being true, and by the way I suspect it is, then a few dozen more tanks and armoured vehicles of ex-Soviet vintage supplied by former Warsaw Pact members who are now part of NATO is not going to make any consequential difference to the war. So that's what I'm going to say about the military situation. There's been more on the sanctions front. Firstly, the Russians have done what they said they would do back in March. They said that if they were prevented from paying their Eurobond payments, their external bond payments in dollars, then they would pay them in rubles. And following the decision yesterday by the US Treasury to block payment of the Russian coupons to the bondholders in dollars from the frozen accounts of the Russian central bank held by JP Morgan, the Russians have now made those payments in rubles. Now, I have to say, I think it's a legally moot question whether Russia is technically in default. And the Russians have said that if the bondholders want to convert their rubles into dollars, then they will have to wait until the central bank reserves, the Russian central bank reserves, are unfrozen. Now, that seems to me to be a fairly broad hint to the bondholders that they should bring legal action against the US Treasury Department to get those reserves unfrozen. Well, we're going to see what's going to happen. It seems to me that there is a massive potential legal issue here if bondholders do decide to bring legal action to try to get the funds unblocked. Well, we will see what the Treasury does in response, and it could go all the way up, it seems to me, to the US Supreme Court, because this is far from being a straightforward issue. But that, of course, does beg the question of whether the bondholders would be prepared to do that, and I'm not going to try to predict what the response of the US courts would be in a legal battle of this nature. But certainly things don't look to me at all straightforward, despite what some people are saying. Anyway, if, as the US Treasury suggested, the intention is to try to get the Russians to drain what's left of their reserves or to divert foreign currency receipts to paying off bondholders, well, that clearly isn't going to happen. And of course, the Russians back in March made it very clear that it wouldn't. We'll see how this turns out. The European Union, for its part, following the events in a suburb of Kiev, which I'm not going to discuss further, I'm not even going to mention its name. The reason is, though it's all over the media, there have been apparently warnings from YouTube that videos that discuss this topic too closely risk being taken down. And quite frankly, I'm not going to go there because I don't really see the need to. I've made my own opinions about this incident fairly well known. Anyway, following that incident, there's been a further push for sanctions from the European Union. I think most people who've looked at these sanctions would say that they were something of a damn squib. The sanctions, the only sanction that is at all new, is sanctions against the blocking imports of thermal coal from Russia. Well, the value of those imports in 2021 was 4 billion euros, which, to be straightforward about it, is frankly an insignificant amount against Russian exports, a total Russian export revenue last year, which was put at something like $1.1 trillion, and which is probably going to actually result in an even higher, bigger Russian trade surplus this year. So I don't think this is a token bite. And besides, I'm fairly certain that coal, which is an internationally traded commodity, Russian coal will almost certainly eventually find its way to other customers anyway. Many countries, India, China, need coal, thermal coal, and there is a global trade in coal, which obviously doesn't go through pipelines. It has to be sent by rail or ship, and I'm pretty sure that this coal will find its way eventually to other customers. So this is in itself a token move, but it's also a sanction against Russian energy imports into Europe. And I think this is perhaps its significance, because on the face of it, the irresistible force, those in the European Union and outside, calling for a complete ban by the European Union on all Russian energy imports, oil, gas, as well as coal. They've suffered another defeat. Once again, the Western governments, which are heavily dependent on coal and oil and gas imports from Russia, have resisted pressure to increase to crank up sanctions against those. But the irresistible force is still there, and I would like to say that countries like Germany, Italy, other countries, Austria, that are very heavily dependent on Russian oil and gas imports, are an immovable obstacle that will continue to resist this pressure indefinitely. But sad to say, I think that is most unlikely. I think it is only a question of time before eventually the Germans and the Austrians crumble and do impose these sanctions and do agree to have these sanctions imposed, unless, of course, there is a political crisis in these countries triggered by the surging inflation rates that they're all suffering from, leading to a change of government which takes a different approach. Now, that is possible, but at the moment I'm not going to assume it. I would say that I've been reading some rather strange articles that have been appearing, and the impression I get is that the advocates of the sanctions against Russian oil and Russian gas appear to think that all that will be needed, is for the European Union to forego Russian oil and gas imports through the summer. This will supposedly finally cause the Russian economy to implode over the course of the summer, and it will force the Russians to come to terms over the course of the summer and end their military operation in Ukraine, so that supposedly all will be sorted out before the winter, when presumably the Europeans, having achieved their goal against Moscow, perhaps having successfully engineered regime change there, can quietly revert to imports of natural gas and oil from the Russians, because the problem will then have been solved. This is what the British like to call the one more heave approach. I have to say, I think that is beyond reckless and straightforwardly wrong. I think that the Europeans and the United States have not judged this issue of sanctions properly, and I think that they will find if they do impose these sanctions, that the Russian economy will continue to crank along through the summer, that there will not be the political crisis in Moscow that they expect. And I think that they have seriously misjudged the situation in Russia. I think all of the smoke and mirrors operations that we're seeing, the pretense, for example, that Germany is reducing its dependence on Russian natural gas, even as it is buying more of it and is feverishly trying to restock its underground gas reserves. All of this is ultimately an exercise in hoping that there will be a political breaking point in Moscow before there is a political breaking point in Europe. And I have to say, I think that is radically wrong, and it is increasingly foolish. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about all of this for the moment. We'll see what happens. I'm pretty sure there will be yet another sanctions package before very long. Though I have to say, I also read in the Financial Times yesterday, squirreled away in a long article about the latest US sanctions, which prohibit, apparently, or are intended to prohibit any US investment in the Russian economy, of which, by the way, there's been precious little anyway. But anyway, squirreled away in an article about that, there was actually an admission in the Financial Times that the United States, for its part, is running out of targets it can sanction in Russia, and that it's now running the risk that if it pursues more sanctions against Russia, that could cause significant damage to the global economy, which of course means, in this context, the US economy. So it seems to me that the Europeans and the Americans are discovering gradually that they're running out of sanctions options, something that they should have perhaps recognized several weeks and months ago. Incidentally, one article that I've seen in the Financial Times uses shock and awe to describe the financial sanctions the Western powers imposed on Russia. That expression, shock and awe, is used for the first time. I would simply remind its writers that shock and awe, which is of course originally a military concept applied by the United States against Iraq, was by most assessments a military and political failure. So it's not perhaps something that one should try to invoke in terms of an economic war of attrition that isn't for the moment going the way some people expected. Anyway, I'm now going to discuss some of the the diplomatic things. The first thing to say is that there was another conversation between the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. And this took place on the 4th of April. And again, there have been various attempts by various people to try to find in it some evidence of a shift in the Chinese position. I'm not going to read out the whole of the Chinese readout, but I would make a few quick observations about it. The first thing to say is that the very first sentence contains these words: on April 4th, 2022, State Council and Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a phone conversation with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba at the latter's request. Now, in many programs on this channel, I've explained that when a readout of a conversation discloses which was the side that asked for the conversation, that is an important fact in itself. That's not the standard practice when two foreign ministers speak to each other on a friendly basis. The Chinese are quietly signaling that it was the Ukrainians who sought this conversation, and in effect it was the Ukrainians who were supplicants who are asking China's help. And the rest of the readout makes that fairly clear, because it turns out that Kuleba showered Wang Yi with flattery and compliments. Consider this sentence. Kuleba introduced the Russian-Ukraine situation, saying that China, a great country, advocating and acting on 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, is a key positive force for maintaining peace. Ukraine attaches importance to China's international influence and prestige, stands ready to maintain communication with China, and hopes that China will continue to play an important role in reaching a ceasefire and stopping the conflict. Well, lots of flattery here. China, a great country, a country that has, Ukraine attaches its importance to China's international influence and its prestige. Well, I wonder whether Kuleba did indeed use this rather, shall we say, over-the-top language. Presumably he did, otherwise it wouldn't be in the Chinese readout. And I'm sure that Wang Yi was listening to it all, perhaps with a ghost of a smile on his face. Anyway, ultimately, Wang Yi gave no hint of any shift in the Chinese position, despite all this flattery, which he must have seen as yet another attempt by the Ukrainians to get the Chinese to try to put pressure on the Russians to end the war on Ukrainian terms. And here we see what the Chinese said, what Wang Yi said. He says that China's basic attitude on the Ukraine issue is to promote peace talks. President Xi Jinping has repeatedly and comprehensively expounded on China's position and propositions, which are important guidelines for us to address the current challenges. It is China's historical and cultural tradition, as well as our consistent foreign policy, to safeguard peace and oppose war. On the Ukraine issue, China does not seek geopolitical self-interest, nor does China have the mentality of watching the fire from a distance, still less doing anything that adds fuel to the fire. These last words, by the way, are implied criticisms of the United States. The Chinese media has been repeatedly saying that it is the United States that has engineered this crisis in Ukraine by pushing Ukraine towards joining NATO, and that it is the United States that has been obstructing the process of peace talks and which wants to see the war continuing. The Chinese media is full of articles like this, and expressions like watching the fire from a safe distance and adding fuel to the fire is how the Chinese describe the conduct of the United States over the course of this war. Anyway, to continue Wang Yi's words, the only goal we sincerely look forward to is peace. China welcomes the Russia-Ukraine peace talks. No matter how difficult the talks are and how many differences they have, the general direction of peace talks should be upheld until a ceasefire is reached and peace is restored. And then we come to the rub. The fighting will eventually come to an end, and the key is how to learn from the painful experience and safeguard the lasting security of Europe. China believes that a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security mechanism should be truly established through equal-footed dialogue based on the principle of indivisible security. Upholding an objective and impartial position in this regard, China will continue to play a constructive role in its own way. China believes that the Ukrainian side has enough wisdom to independently make choices in line with the fundamental interests of its people. Now, this requires a little decoding, but when Wang Yi talks about lasting security in Europe, the need for a balanced, effective and sustainable security mechanism, and the need to base it on the principle of indivisible security. What Wang Yi is saying is that the Europeans need to sit down with the Russians, need to accept that Russia has legitimate security guarantees, as of course does Ukraine, and needs to construct a security mechanism that takes all that into account on the principle of indivisible security, which effectively means no further eastward expansion of NATO. So that's what Wang Yi is saying. He is repeating all the points that the Russians have been saying ever since they proposed those two draft treaties back in December, which they suggested an outline for the future, a future establishment of a security mechanism in Europe. And I would add that his point, that Wang Yi's point, saying that the China believes that the Ukrainian side has enough wisdom to independently make choices in line with the fundamental interests of its people. The operative word is independently make choices. In other words, Ukraine should stop listening to the bad advice of its Western allies. It should look to the situation in Ukraine itself and make a decision consistent with its own interests and its own needs, and make it independently of its erstwhile friends. Now, that was Wang Yi. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has also spoken, and I'd like to discuss this because, of course, it casts his words, which is a statement that Lavrov made, again in connection with the events in that suburb of Kiev, but it actually casts light on the actual progress of the negotiations. Now, I said in a video which I made last week following the talks in Istanbul that, contrary to what everybody was saying, or what people in the Western media were saying, it was the Ukrainians that made the concessions, not the Russians, and that there is no evidence that the Russians have backpedaled on any of their underlying demands. And in fact, that is now been made crystal clear by Lavrov in this statement. And he says the following. He says that the ongoing negotiations had reached a point when some light, however dim, has appeared at the end of the tunnel. At the talks in Istanbul on March 29th, Ukrainian representatives set forth in writing their vision for a treaty on Ukraine's status and security guarantees for the first time during contacts between our delegations. For the first time ever, the Ukrainian side has put on paper that it is prepared to declare Ukraine a neutral, non-aligned and non-nuclear state, and to refuse to deploy weapons from foreign states on its territory, or to conduct exercises on its territory with the participation of foreign military personnel, unless they are approved by all guarantors of the future treaty, including the Russian Federation. The security guarantees envisaged by the treaty are a step towards everyone realizing that the negotiations need to completely rule out NATO's eastward expansion, primarily to Ukraine, and to ensure indivisible security in Europe. The Ukrainian side itself included in this draft of the main clauses of the treaty a provision saying that the security guarantees that will be provided to Ukraine in the event of an agreement will not apply to Crimea and Donbass. This is also a sign of significant progress in terms of Kiev making a realistic assessment of the status of these territories. In accordance with the Istanbul agreements and as a gesture of goodwill, the Russian side decided to de-escalate the situation on the ground, primarily in the Kiev and Chernigov regions. And then he describes at length the latest furore. I'm afraid, sorry if that's a somewhat understated term for this affair, but again, I have to use careful language because of the constraints YouTube is imposing on me. It should not be taken to reflect my own feelings about it. But then, to continue with what Lavrov said, we believe that the international community, which must know the truth, which is that the Russian side is ready to keep negotiating in good faith. If the Ukrainian delegation is going to continue to talk about the need for additional steps on the part of the Russian Federation, vehemently refuse, as it is doing now, even to discuss the goals of denazification and demilitarization and restoring Russian language rights, and insist that there are no problems with the Russian language or the rights of the Russian-speaking people and Nazification reaching all areas of that country's life, I do not think this will be helpful in advancing the negotiation process. And Lavrov makes it very clear that he considers that the present uproar is a product of concern on the part of some people in Kiev and more people in Washington, London and Brussels about the direction of the negotiations and about the fact that the Ukrainians appear to be making substantive concessions, even though these have not yet reached the point where the Russians feel fully satisfied that all their demands are being met. And then he finishes by saying that in order for us to make real progress, instead of just the appearance of progress, we insist that Kiev be sent an unambiguous message not to resort to sabotage. Otherwise, we risk repeating the fate of the Minsk agreements, and that is something we will never do. It is disquieting that the Ukrainian side has decided to demand that the conclusion of a treaty mean that all hostilities must stop within several days and the Russian armed forces must leave Ukraine. After that, a referendum will supposedly be held and ratification will take place in the parliament. It is highly likely that when the treaty is voted down, we will have to start the negotiating process all over again. We are not going to play this cat and mouse game. We do not want a repeat of the Minsk agreements. We cannot allow that to happen. Now, that is the clearest hint that I have seen that the Russians intend to keep their troops in Ukraine beyond the borders, the territories of Donbass, in places like Kherson, Zaporozhye and wherever, until Ukraine not only signs but ratifies this treaty, which is one which the Russians insist must make fundamental concessions on the state of Crimea and Donbass and on the issues of demilitarization and denazification, and put those provisions fully into effect. So this is going to be a protracted process, but now we see what the Russian perspective on all this is. So no retreat from the Russians in terms of their objectives. I think the reporting that we were getting last week, or at least some of that reporting, was profoundly wrong, and not just wrong, but actively and intentionally misleading. It is the Ukrainians who are making the concessions. It is the Russians who are sticking to their demands, not the other way around. Anyway, I've noticed, by the way, that these comments of Lavrov have received almost no publicity in certainly the British media. Anyway, there we are. We are still in a diplomatic impasse. Zelensky has said that the negotiations will continue. Ukraine's attempts to get the Chinese to put pressure on the Russians have again gone nowhere, despite all the flattery he poured out. The Russians continue to proceed with their military operations. Mariupol is now essentially, as far as I can see, mopped up, apart from the Azovstal factory and a holdout in the port area, which is, by the way, very territorially restricted. And elsewhere in Donbass, the vice is tightening around the Ukrainian forces there. So in the meantime, we've seen the Russians make their decision on the coupon payments, paying in rubles. Surprising how little attention that's received, by the way, given how important it appeared back in March. And we've seen the Europeans pass another symbolic set of sanctions, but with relentless pressure from the hardliners for more sanctions all the time, until finally all economic links between Europe and Russia are fully severed, whatever cost that imposes on the European economy. That's, it seems to me, where we are at the moment. I hope this has provided some clarity about the overall position. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, not just Rumble and Locals, as I discussed at the start of this program. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there. And last but not least, please don't forget to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button if you've liked this video. Thank you for joining me again today. Have a very good day wherever you are, and I look forward to you joining me again soon.